think we'll get started then. Yeah? Good. Welcome everybody. I think this is the last session. I hope you've had a useful and profitable 1 or 2 days, depending on how long you've been here. Just to make sure, this is a session about GDPR. If you're not in the right room, exit at the back. So, what I'd like to do first of all is just to have a quick, brief overview of GDPR, who I am, who the panel are. We're going to ask them some questions, and then what we'll then do is to open it up to you to ask, guys who are doing it every day, what their best tips are. So let me first of all introduce myself. My name is Ross Simpson. I run a business called the Insight Republic. I'm also an associate of Eden Smith, who are over there, who are talking about the Nurture Academy today, but I've been asked to chair this GDPR panel because I'm currently working for Sainsbury's Group in a GDPR role. And what my job is to work on the data governance side, on the legal side of things, and get Sainsbury's ready to be compliant, as well as Sainsbury's Bank, Argos and Habitat. So one of the challenges we face is what data do we have, where is it, how do we communicate with our 180,000 staff on if they get a request, how to deal with it, and those colleagues that we have working for us, how do they then get, if they want to do a subject access request, how do they get that information, how do we make it that we provide that information, and all things right to be forgotten and otherwise. So, GDPR. It's law soon. Does anybody know the date when it becomes ready? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, it's gone a bit. No, okay. So we're almost there. 25th of May, for those people next year who are unsure of the date, that we have to be evidence that we are compliant. European-wide regulation on the processing of personal data, enacted to harmonise data protection legislation across the European Economic Area, and the government have confirmed it will come into effect despite Brexit. Okay, so it will be law. Principles. There's the 8 principles of the Data Protection Act, but underneath GDPR, it's the lawfulness, it's fairness and transparency, it's purpose limitation, data minimization, it's accuracy, storage limitation, integrity and confidentiality, and importantly, accountability. So, who have we got on our panel? Ian. I think it's probably fair to say Ian's a gamekeeper poacher, or one way or the other. He's going to talk a little bit more about himself, but he's currently head of information and privacy at Cox Automotive, but previously worked at the ICO, hence the reason for why I'm saying he's one and the other. So I'm sure it'll be interesting to get an insider's view of what's really going on. So I hope we can expose some truths today. We've then got Andy. Andy? There we go. Head of Information and Privacy. Sorry, no, you're not. Andy, Head of Solutions and Governance at Informatica. Yeah? Next, we've got Julian, lead GDPR consultant in Solar Group, and has worked and put, I think you call it solutionizing or something like that. We can talk a bit more about that. But across a number of industries, banking, telephony, retail, etc. And last but not least, we've got Jean-Michel Franco, Senior Director of Product Marketing for Talent, who've got a stand out there, do a lot of stuff around the systems, bringing the data together and helping you manage it. So what I'm going to do is just ask the panel to kick off with. Ian, let's start. Tell me in a couple of minutes what you're doing in your GDPR journey.
Everything. Because there's only me, essentially. So a lot of the things that you covered off in terms of individuals' rights, data governance processes, I'm responsible effectively for implementing all of that as far as GDPR is concerned across the Cox Automotive UK group of companies. So we have 11 companies, I think. I've only been with the group 3 months, but we've got 11 companies, and we've got to implement GDPR across all those, as well as the parent company, the holding company. So I've got people within each company who are working with me on that in terms of looking at our policies and procedures and things like that. But essentially, it's my responsibility to oversee GDPR implementation across the whole group, and that basically encompasses all aspects of it, from individuals' rights, principles, making sure our breach management procedures are in place. Like I said, everything basically.
Okay, cool. Next.
You okay?
Yep.
Good, thank you. So my GDPR journey started around about 2 years ago, and effectively when I work with our many customers, many of them are organizations who are already spending the time doing lots of good things with data. I think last year, my journey was actually just educating and enabling people around what GDPR could be for them, what the opportunities may be, but also some of the things they're going to have to think about doing. And I think this year, and I think going into next year, I think that journey, if you like, I think has changed somewhat. I think organizations, are a lot further along in their thinking, and they're now translating what it is they were talking about last year and earlier this year into things they will have to do and activities they're going to have to put in place. So what for me has been great about the whole journey is I think we're actually getting to the stage now where organizations saying, yeah, actually we do recognize there's a value in our data. We do have to do something for GDPR, but actually data is just valuable in its own right. So are there things that we can do off the back of GDPR that helps us unlock the value of our data?
Okay. Julian?
Yeah, hi there. So I got called into one of the major UK insurance firms in June last year. They said there's this thing called GDPR, and we need to know what to do about it. So 8 months later, we'd produced the solutioning, what needs to be done for that firm. After that, went into a major UK retail bank who were in flight with their data programs, and brought all of those together under one banner. And from those two experiences, we have at Solar, we've developed a one-size-fits-all GDPR solution, which we've then applied to some leading UK retailers and recruitment consultancies.
Okay. Jean-Michel?
Yes, so I've been in the world of data management since a couple of years in CRM, in analytics, and I've seen the power of data getting bigger and bigger, up to a point that companies are realizing that there's risk and they need to take control of their data. So that's the governance play, and we see GDPR as a perfect example of companies that have to operationalize that data governance. So we've seen that in some industries that were regulated, like banking or healthcare, but now we see data governance becoming a mandate across any industry, and the GDPR is the most recent example, industry-wide, and where company now needs to take action because of the timeline. So that's how I came to that, and how we managed at our company to create a solution for that was part of my journey since I joined Talent.
Okay, thank you. So that's your panel. So let's get some audience participation. Who's working currently on GDPR? Okay, so that's about a quarter. For the businesses that you work for and with, how many of you have now got a DPO in place? A lot less. So that's about 10. Okay, so legitimate interest, you must be all working behind that. I think it's the interesting thing. I've done a number of GDPR programs recently for Severn Trent Water, Ordnance Survey, and now currently for Sainsbury's. And I think the thing that I've seen when we're talking to the board about it, the first thing that got their attention was it's a fine of up to 4% of global turnover. There you go. Suddenly, in regulated industries, I walked into npower to help their transformation on BI, and 2 weeks later got a £26 million fine. And then for the way we were managing our customer complaints process. So it depends, I think, on the industry you're working on, about the size of the fine and the size of the risk. But is there anybody from TalkTalk here today? No? Okay, so I can be a little bit freer perhaps with the comments than I might have been. Is anybody aware of what happened with TalkTalk? Just let a show of hands. Okay, so for those of you who don't, they first of all got a breach for around £400,000 for a cyber attack. And then they had a second fine, which was from the ICO for £100,000 for a breach for 26 of their staff who stole data from their contact center in India. And their CEO had to go on live on television and explain how they managed to lose that to their customers and how they managed to do it not once but twice. If you look at the ICO, they have not yet fined anybody. I think I'm right in saying for over £500,000 yet. No, so that's not the maximum. So I wonder with somebody who's been today, I think there's been between 5,000 and 6,000 people coming through. One of their CEOs might be the first to go on national television to get the first 8-figure fine. I think if you haven't got your DPOs and you haven't got your GDPR plans in place, I think we'll ask the panel this one, but I think, Ian, your words are get cracking.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have two key messages today, really. One is don't panic, so that doesn't help when we're talking about 8-figure fines, but we have to exist. We have to realise that we're moving into a world where they exist, and where, the risks of non-compliance with data protection law now are going to be far greater than they are under the current regime. But equally, kind of don't panic in the sense that it's not the end of the world. It's not some kind of data Armageddon. The 25th of May is not the off switch for 90% of what businesses are doing with their information. It's, and I think there's a lot of information out there at the minute. When you go on LinkedIn, you go on Twitter, you read articles in the media about how we're all going to have to stop doing things, or we're all going to immediately be fined 20 million euros or 80 million quid, whatever it ends up being in pounds. On the 26th of May, if something's not right. I don't see that. I don't see that based on my time at the ICO and the way they handle things. I don't see that based on the messages coming out of the ICO themselves. They've put blogs out where they've said that that's not going to be the case. I don't see that on the basis of the fact that in 7 years they haven't fined somebody 500 grand yet. So the idea that the day after GDPR comes in, someone's going to get a 20 million euro fine. But equally, I say don't panic because it's not as new as people make it out to be. It's like all new data protection law. It takes what we had before. It keeps a lot of the elements that are familiar, and then it builds on it. So the 6 principles in the GDPR are pretty much the same as 6 of the 8 principles that are in the DPA. The 2 things that aren't in principles are still in the GDPR. They're just not there as principles. Your overseas transfers and your individual's rights. But the principles themselves are largely the same. Most of the rights that currently exist are largely the same. There's a few tweaks. Yes, there are some new ones. Yes, you're going to have to look at your systems to decide whether or not you can comply with the right to data portability. Can you restrict processing of personal data? Do you have to make some changes there? But if you look at the first principle under the GDPR, it's pretty much the same as it is now. Okay, they've separated out fairness and transparency, but those 2 concepts are not new. It's just getting us away from the fact now that transparency is about telling people what you're going to do. Fairness is partly that, but it's also more than that. But that's the same as it is now. So I don't think it's helpful when you have these people who are saying, it's the end of the world. It really isn't, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Andy, in terms of governance, I guess my question there would be, what role does governance play within GDPR from your perspective?
So I think governance has a number of different roles it can play. I would think that's kind of part of my job to understand and work around governance. But the way I see this manifesting itself is actually sometimes it's just some very simple, basic concepts. Just understanding what data organizations actually have, who has access to it, for what purpose, those kind of basic questions. In the world of governance, we'd always be asking those questions, but actually they take on a slightly different context in the world of GDPR, because data is now just fundamental to what it is that we have to report on, but it's also about the lifeblood of our organizations. So governance gives me the ability to control my data, to understand my data, so I know what I'm going to do with it from a GDPR viewpoint. But part of that then just comes back to many organizations just don't know what data they have about individuals, about persons. I was talking to a bank recently who just said to me, we have lots of data, we just don't know if we have the right data. And I think that's quite a telling case. In the world of governing your data, just one of the key things I would suggest to people is, whatever you're going to do for GDPR, just understanding what data you've got, just understand the data basics. What data have you got? Where is it? Who has access to it? Who's using it for what purpose? Even if you can just understand that, there's massive value as an organization in just understanding your data, because now you're in a place where you can start to recognize what it is you can or can't do with that data. And GDPR would be a use case, I guess, as an example for that. But there are many other use cases of how you drive value from your data. So I see governance as being kind of a two-sided activity. The first is helping understand data and putting some control around data for GDPR, but it's also about helping unlock the value of data so organizations can do some more value-added things with it.
I think that's a great point. I think one of the things that, speaking to a number of boards that I've had about GDPR, they see it as, the CFO, when he's suddenly seen the CEO, turns around and says, you're personally accountable. You will get the letter from the ICO landing on your desk, and you will have to show an evidence that you are compliant. I think one of the things that there is the carrot and the stick. The stick is clearly the fine, but actually brand reputation damage is probably a bigger impact if you lose your customers' data. But I think there's the other side of the GDPR, which is a lot of what we're working on, is about staff requests. So is everybody aware that obviously what we've got to do is to get the data about anybody who works for you. So if they have a grievance, they have the right to see all of that information, and you have got to bring it out within 30 days. People aware of that? Yeah? Getting some nods around the room. I think one of the interesting things as well is, we were talking earlier about the idea of, when I was introducing to Julian, you were saying that you've worked across a number of different sectors. Do you see a difference in GDPR implementation readiness across sectors?
Got me? So, well, no. So that was what was surprising, working in the financial sector and the insurance sector and then the retail sector. The principles are the same. The end goal is absolutely clear. So that's published. It is the regulation. Everybody has to get to that end goal of compliance. Sorry. Okay. So let me say that again. So no. What we found at Solar, working in the financial sector, the insurance sector, and the retail sector, recruitment sector, the end goal is exactly the same. It's very clear. It's published. It's in the articles. Everybody needs to strive to get to optimum compliance as listed. The big challenge is, or the big question is, where are you now? So if you don't know where you are, then you're not going to know how to get to the end goal where everyone is aiming for. But it's the same across all businesses, of all sizes and all sectors. So yeah, and if I could just make a point about the data conversation that we were having before. So the analogy that I like to make is the same as your children. If you don't know where your children are and what they're doing, you can't protect them. It's exactly the same for your data. So if you don't know where it is, what you're doing with it, you cannot protect it. It's a nice analogy that I like to use.
We were talking earlier about things like accountability. Tell me a little bit more about your view of that.
Yeah, so in some sense, sometimes I compare data protection and data governance with global warming. So everyone cares, but it's in our minds, we tend to think that it's the other one's problem. And until you don't have someone who owns, who is responsible, then it's very, very difficult to act. And so we see a lot of difference between some around the customer case we see on those that are clear accountabilities, and then they drive action because they can find what is the problem, but also who will act. And so we mentioned Save the Children. It happens that so we have an NGO that is our customer, Save Our Children. So those guys, they understand that their customer, they don't want to be annoyed, they don't want to, it's very risky for them to send too many emails and things like that. So they value a lot the data that they have, the customers, the interaction that they have around them. And so they were very rapid to get into this compliance story, because they have the responsibility around the fact that, okay, they understand that they get the money from donors only if they don't annoy the customer. Of course, they know that they cannot sell the data that they have about you to a commercial company or things like that. So they have that from the start in their processes, etc. So I think it's a matter of accountability. Until you don't have the accountability, it will be very hard to start your GDPR journey, I think.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions shortly, but I think you've got some experts here and me, so I'll just give you my penneth worth, what I think is important. Something that's been troubling us is to think about, okay, how do we put the customer and colleague at the heart of what we're doing around GDPR? So one of my challenges to you is think about what your customers are going to ask for and what their expectations of what they're going to get, and are you going to give that to them? And the same for colleagues would be one of the questions I would put into your GDPR program. Next, let's just go down the line one by one. So speaker one on this chair, and then we'll go down. Yeah, Jean-Michel.
Didn't get your point. Sorry. Can you get it? Can you get it back? I didn't get your point.
Get my point. So what's your best tip for the audience on GDPR?
Yeah, okay. So I just mentioned accountability. So set up the accountability, then prioritize, because there's a lot of things to do in GDPR. We already know, and I think even the Commission is pretty okay that it's a journey, and that you need to show on the 25th of May that you are on the right track. So it's all about prioritizing. So I think that often I hear things like having the portal for the data subject. So sharing the data with the customer is a priority because it's my customer, it's something that is external. So define your priorities and then get practical. So get hands-on on the different project to make it very concrete and to have the lines of business on board.
Okay, so prioritize and make it practical.
Yeah, okay, so my sort of one takeaway for everybody here would be it is doable, it is logical, it is finite, but do not underestimate the size of it, because data is everywhere in your organization. Everybody is responsible. One of the things that we like to say is sort of about decorating. If you've ever tried it yourself, you spend 2 weeks getting covered in paint, making a mess, and then you end up calling the expert to come and not only do the job that you were going to do in the first place, but also fix the mess that you've made. Yeah, if you don't know what you're doing, ask for help.
Yeah. Andy?
So my one tip, I think, would be really just get a handle on your data. And the three questions that I always ask organizations in terms of getting a handle on your data is one, what data do you have? Two, who has access to it? And three, for what purpose? If you can answer those questions, then I think it moves you a long way. I'm seeing lots of organizations taking a risk-based approach to GDPR in terms of what it is we can do and the order in which we can do those things. We probably need to apply those same risk-based principles to our data as well, given the task of what we've got to do between now and May next year.
Right. And finally, Ian?
I just build on that risk-based approach is really important, because I don't think with the best will in the world, especially if you haven't even started yet, you are not going to get yourself 100% compliant by the 25th of May next year. I think for a lot of people who started 2 years ago, they're still not going to get themselves 100% compliant by the 25th of May next year. So I think if you've done everything that my colleagues on the panel have said you've done about understanding where you are at the minute, then once you've got that in place, you can actually develop a risk plan. Where are the big risks for your business in the area that you work? You know, is it your contracts with your third parties? Is it the fact that you hold loads of sensitive personal data and you're not sure what your security measures are and whether they're appropriate or not? Have a look at where you are, or find out where you are first of all, and then when you know where you are, develop a risk-based approach based on your risk appetite and the business that you're in and the data that you hold, and get your priorities done by the 25th of May. And for me, I'd say focus on your public-facing stuff like your privacy notices. Make sure you're in a position to deal with individuals' rights, because they won't wait. Come the 26th of May, people will start making SARs. They're going to start making requests for erasure. But after that, it's whatever you think is the biggest risk for your business, and focus on those.
Thank you. And I think, there's predictions of Armageddon, anything from 5 subject access requests a week to 10,000. So I think the answer is, honestly, we don't know what's going to happen yet. but I think you need to be ready to have both scenarios at least thought through. Can we get a mic perhaps and then just say who does want any questions? Right, okay, well we've got 4 to start with, so lady at the front here. Can you just say who you are, what you do, and then what your question is would be lovely.
Hi, I'm Anna. I work for Mercer. Our clients are companies, but we also have data about their employees because we sell benefits. So cycle to work scheme, salary sacrifice, things like that. We manage it for the companies. And we use data for 2 main purposes. One, for analytics, because companies usually need to know how much am I spending on cycle to work, for example. And we use it to improve people's health and wealth. So give individual advice to users that ask for it. So they.
And the question?
And the question is, when we need to comply to delete my data request, where do we need to delete our data? That's the question that's been all over.
Okay, so
Thank you.
it's deleting my data. Who wants to pick that one up first? Ian, go for it.
Right. So the first thing I would say is obviously there's only a fixed series of circumstances where the right to erasure applies. So first of all, you've got to figure out whether one of those does. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but it's things like if you no longer need it for your purpose, if you're relying on consent and it's withdrawn and you've got no other basis for processing. So the first thing to check is, well, actually, does an obligation to erase actually arise? The likelihood is that in most cases it probably won't, I think. But that doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't be prepared for the times when it does. If it does, then there's this whole question about what is deletion, which, when I was at the ICR, I couldn't believe that we had a piece of guidance on what is deletion, because to me at the time I was like, well, you just delete it. I mean, I'm not naive enough. I know that if you format a hard drive, you can still get stuff back. So I think there's going to be a degree of waiting to see, whether or not you take that as your baseline and say, well, currently it's kind of like you've deleted it if you've kind of put it beyond use, even if it's technically feasible to get it back. If that remains the case, we'll have to wait and see. Hopefully it does, because otherwise I think the implications of the right to erasure, when it does apply, could be quite significant.
Yeah, and trying to find that across systems. The other thing is going to be around, do you anonymize the information? Clearly you've got to make sure that you stop marketing people, because that's one of the main things that people are going to get caught out by, I guess. Anybody else want to comment, or should we go to the next question? Next question? One more? Okay, so you had your hand up first, so I'm going to pick you, and then the other questions will stay behind if you want to come and ask us.
So sort of similar related question, but when you have to delete or do anything to someone's data based on GDPR, does it have to be for free, or can you monetize it in any way? Because it could have quite significant costs.
Okay.
Well, I mean, basically, the GDPR basically says any communications or actions taken in respect of individuals' rights should be free of charge, with the exception of the subject access, where you can charge if it's manifestly unfounded or excessive. So, and who knows what that means? It's solicitor's dream, a phrase like that. But yeah, generally speaking, it's all free of charge. So.
Correct. Okay, am I allowed one more or not? One more. You were there first, with the glasses on the row. Okay, and then we'll go.
Hi, Johnny Caldwell, NetQuest, where we do market research, online panels, and passive measurement. I wondered what the panel thought would happen with anonymous browser plugins, which kind of occur through ISPs and things like that. So they kind of monitor your behavior, online behavior, but it's kind of hidden within a massive privacy statement. What do you see happening with that? Will it be similar to cookies?
My view
Ian as well again.
Sorry, I'm not hugging it. If anybody else has got something to say, feel free. I mean, essentially for me, one, if it's truly anonymous, then is it personal data? So that will depend, as it always does. So if it's not personal data, then it's not subject to the GDPR. If it is personal data, is there an argument that it falls within profiling? Probably, if it's monitoring people's behavior. And if it falls within profiling, then you've got all the stuff around greater transparency and all the other shenanigans that goes on around the GDPR to do with that. So I can't really answer the question specifically because it will depend on whether it's truly anonymous or not. If it's not, I think it's going to be profiling, and you're going to have all the bells and whistles that comes with that as well.
So I think, to finalise, I think my comment would be on a lot of this stuff. The answer is it depends.